Well, for those of you who missed it, today is Easter. We started last week with Palm Sunday and the story of a doomed mission of love confronting empire. Then Thursday, we shared the Last Supper and read the story of Jesus' death and left in silence and in the dark. And today we march in triumphantly with bells and bright clothes and chocolates and some fancy hats. I see a little bit of hats. And I know we want to just celebrate today like it's the happiest day of the year, but I also know most of us don't know why we are doing this at all. You see, we are rational people. We don't believe that 2,000 years ago some miracle happened and Jesus crawled out of a tomb and came back to life. So why all the fuss? The answer is short but needs some stories, and if these stories don't help you, just ponder this: that this is no time or place to ignore the world's challenges. As well, it is no time or place to give in to the world's crumbling edges and despair. To celebrate today is to take part in a giant annual reboot of our humanity. It is to reset our hope so that we do not leave here hopeless, but are filled with love. And if that's not enough of a miracle, then Easter has not done its work, but wait, there is more. The theologian that you hear me turn to so often, named Paul Tillich, tells a story about a witness in the Nuremberg trials who told of a man who lived in a grave in Vilna, the largest city in Poland, now Lithuania. You see, the Nazis captured Vilna in June of 1941, partitioned it to ghetto the Jews to eliminate them. This man's story goes that he went and lived in a grave because it was the only hiding place that the Nazis would not look for him. And while he was there, he wrote poetry to stay sane. One poem was about a young woman who gave birth to a boy in a grave. The old gravedigger assisted. The newborn uttered a first cry, and the old man prayed, "Great God, hast thou finally sent the Messiah to us? For who else than a Messiah could be born in a grave?" After 3 days, the poet said the child was suckling the mother's tears because she had no milk. Tillich explains that in Easter we skip over the burial for the cheerful ending of resurrection. That to be buried is to be erased, removed from personality, dead and unaware. And he reminds us the poet who lived in a tomb to hide from the Nazis was alive to tell the story and had stories to tell the court. And the miracle of his resolve was an Easter story in itself. In today's Easter story, Jesus is buried after being erased for his uprising against the state. He is a rebel who is condemned after being given up to the authorities by his friend and given up on by his friends who abandoned him. He is a symbol for many in his time of the possibility that love and kindness might actually win, until he is taken away in chains and tried and killed. He is a life giver, as my colleague said during Lent, but his life is taken, and so the story looks fairly grim. But this is not an HBO series. This is Coda, and this is Frozen, and all those stories where hope prevails. And the church has said a lot about this story. And the church has said a lot about this story. And whoever Jesus is to you today, I say he is a symbol of something beyond what the church has ever said about him. He is compassion, and he is love. He is the Buddha, and he is Martin Luther King, and he is Gandhi, and he is Sojourner Truth, and he is love. Today, the tomb is empty, And the disciples are down in the mouth as they travel down that road. They do not see that life lives again in love, even in the face of losing their teacher and friend. They do not see that love will always win, that it will always uncover the layers of death and despair that rest upon us. We call them the disciples for a reason. Don't be like the disciples. When we allow the world to bury us with its many stories of failed humanity, of war, of destruction and pain, we fail the world. We fail at gratitude and to live into our highest ideals and into our faith, and we hide in tombs that we build. When we are buried by our despairs, when we don't speak up when we know things are wrong, when we let our despair hide our eyes from the miracle of the day, we don't see love living on, and we fail love and the world that way. But Easter says no tomb can contain the human spirit, just like it couldn't contain Jesus in the Easter story. So here's another story for you. I was sitting in a tomb a few weeks ago, not a literal stone tomb, but I was on a plantation on the shores of the Mississippi River in Louisiana that is now a museum of slavery called the Whitney Plantation. Now, I've studied the period of slavery, and I know the stories, and when I was a kid, I saw Roots, and I read many essays, and I know about the horrors and the impact on us, and there I was sitting on a wooden bench looking out an open window in a creaky wooden shack where human beings had lived and died over 150 years of enslavement. And the worst thing was that their families had continued to live in that shack as sharecroppers and poor farmers on that plantation until 1975. And I sat on that creaky bench in that room, and I imagined the pain and the struggle that happened there. The cold drafts that rushed through the cracks of the wall, the horrible weeping of separated families and sickness and death. And for the first time in my life, being immersed in that place, I felt the whole weight of that time in our country and how it lives in us. And I wondered how anyone survived that and how we survive any of it still. And I looked out across the Mississippi River, a river so wide and fierce that it seems an impossible barrier to anyone who would want to escape that horror. And I saw beyond that the swamps that extended 100 miles and thought about how enslaved people would have to swim and slog, being chased and live in trees and go as far as it would take you and me to walk today from here to St. Louis to get to freedom. And I thought of courageous people who did survive those journeys. And not only that, I thought of people who turned their survival into aid for others. And I thought of Harriet Tubman and others who tried to end this hell, and how Tubman, who traveled back and forth to the southern plantations of Maryland, who was personally so convicted to help others that at age 12, she spotted an overseer about to throw a heavy object at a fugitive enslaved man, and she stepped between them. The weight struck her head. She said later about the incident, "The weight broke my skull." They carried me to a house all bleeding and fainting. I had no bed, no place to lie down on at all. They laid me on the seat of the loom, and I stayed there all day and the next. And Harriet's good deed left her with headaches and narcolepsy the rest of her life, causing her to fall asleep into a deep sleep at random. And she started having vivid dreams and hallucinations, which she claimed were religious visions that told her she must commit to the freedom of others, and thank God she did. And I thought all this sitting in that ramshackle hut, looking up toward the big house where the owners dined on pheasant and coconut rice prepared by the people they bought in the markets in New Orleans. And I thought, Harriet Tubman, she could have stayed in Philadelphia, that city of brotherly love, once she got to freedom. But she didn't, because staying free while others are tormented was another kind of tomb for her. So she returned many times to help others. Some say she freed 300 people from the horrors of slavery in that place. And in places like where I sat in that shack, looking out at the fields, the people worked for the economy of New Orleans and the wealth of white families. And I thought of the people who were named on the monuments 100 yards from that shack. Thousands of enslaved people who were sold in New Orleans and died in places like that shack. And I wondered if there was ever hope in that place. And then I looked out the other window and I saw a church on the property. And I walked up to it and heard its story, and I heard how it was built after emancipation. And the people called it the Anti-Yoke Church. It is now the Antioch Church, but it was once the Anti-Yoke Church. And I imagine they heard the story you heard today that Ruth told us so well. And they knew back then, when they were throwing off the yoke of slavery, that someday their families would survive all this and transform our country with a whole lot of courage. And that churches like theirs would fight the yokes of oppression and conformity and preach against the yokes of despair. When we wake up and see life transforming and transformed before us, like when a preacher is sitting in a slave shack feeling the history of all that horror and also the victory over it and also the incredible work still ahead of us, we are enlivened to what resurrection is like. And we know it can happen. We know that resurrection takes courage, the kind of courage that looks like people in a church committing to be part of love's army and fighting despair, and somehow, whether it is Jesus showing up or the Spirit of love's victory showing up, how faith in life changes us and changes the world. Now, I'm sure you've all had moments in your life when you were rebooted to your own humanity, or when you were resurrected in some way. Somehow, maybe you were sitting with your family and they showed you how to make a difference in the world, or you were going down the road and something weird happened, or you all of a sudden felt drilled down into by the world's love, and we call that resurrection. Love's victory over death and despair. That is why I'm telling you these stories. Stories about when the war ends and a man emerges from a grave alive and he is a new hope for people and for us. Is why I'm telling you a story about sitting in a slave shack and seeing both the victory over it and the incredible despair of it. Is why I am asking you what you will do with your despair, and whether you have courage to face the odds of life not turning out how you wish, and yet you still have hope. That's the kind of courage that it took Jesus to climb out of the tomb with, and Tubman to hike back into Maryland. And that's the kind of courage that takes any of us to wake up in love with life more than we were the day before. Our task today in this great Easter reboot is to be awakened to possibility, to be in love with the world in the face of great despair. Our task is to see the mission of love and justice not as someone else's, but as ours. Now, maybe for you, the story of the resurrected Jesus is what gives you hope, but for me, the very fact that the story exists and has lasted through history is what gives me hope. Because it exists, because hope does not die even in the face of reality. The disciples on the road come to understand Jesus lives in them when they share that loaf of bread. They remember that life includes many endings and always new beginnings. And that out of whatever grave we hide in, whatever unknowing, unseeing reality we walk in, life's blessings, the Christ blessing is in the air we breathe when we are awake to it. So here's what I am saying to you today, that you are called on this Easter to awaken and not despair. To remove the yoke of whatever is holding you back, to stare into the face of death and war and divisiveness and whatever you are carrying that is hard, and know life will transform it. That we all can climb out of any tomb we have made and make the world better, and we must. So with the poet's words in my mouth, I say to you, quit your addiction to sneer and complaint. Be prepared to bump into wonder. Only love prevails. And en route to disaster, insist on canticles. And know that you are closer to glory, leaping an abyss, than upholstering a rut. And lift your ineffable out of the mundane and walk toward clarity. At every crossroad, you be prepared to bump into wonder. And remember, nothing perishes, nothing survives, everything transforms. And if you don't remember anything I have said today, remember this, that the poet said, meet every day you can like a honeymoon with big joy. That's what you can do. That's what we are called on, friends. We are called to see that life can emerge from death, not because Jesus said so, but because life is holy and life is good. And it is right here before us. A happy Easter to you, friends. Amen and amen.